And now I'd like to invite Dr. Jonathan Petropoulos to join us as the next speaker.
It is great to be back here at Fairfield. I heard from my friend Philip Elias last night. This is my fourth talk at Fairfield over the years. I almost feel like I've been more than that, but Philip and Gav and Ellen and the Fairfield crew, what a wonderful institution you have here, and it's great to be back. And thank you to Carrie and Michelle and Rosalinda, all the organizers. I feel we're on a first name basis now, right? So thank you all. I'm going to show a lot of slides very quickly, so apologies ahead of time. I'm a historian, not an art historian. My art history friends say you should stop and analyze the images more, but I'm going to go quickly. And I'm going to do a number of things today. Well, my thesis, using the slide from the Vienna Secession, 1897, to each era its own, to art its freedom. My thesis is that Arthur Szyk was profoundly tied to the period in which he lived and worked, and that to understand Szyk, we need to understand the broader context. And I'm going to talk about the broader context for the first half of my talk in three areas. The first concerns media and technology and where it was when he started to do his work really after World War I. The second are the culture wars that he was fighting against fascist aesthetic, if you will, against Nazis and their allies, and he was a culture warrior. The third, for the first half of the talk, will be about how he navigated between high culture and popular culture, and how this was a source of strength and also made him more profoundly tied to his times. And then fourth, finally, I'll talk about an artwork, the missing masterpiece, Satan Leads the Ball, and that's what I wrote about in my article for the catalog. So, Arthur Szyk, right? We've seen lots of pictures of him. I'll move quickly. What was the state of media when he started to work? And I think it's really important to realize there was a kind of revolution when it comes to media and technology. You know, look what most Europeans experienced before World War I in terms of culture, right? There was no radio. You know, cinema was very, very limited. They lived in villages and towns, and they really didn't have access to very much culture. And I argue that this was a precondition that allowed the Nazis and fascists more generally in Europe to seize control. And they were very effective, the Nazis, in using culture instrumentally to fight. So we have to understand where people are, where the audience is in terms of the history of technology. Of course, we know the radio and how important that's going to become in the 1930s, where culture comes inside the domestic sphere, into the home, right? Think about films, right? Well, of course, we'd had silent films before World War I, but there's a tremendous change in 1928 when we have talking films, right? And you think about that, what it means in terms of communication and reaching an audience. And this was a new form to reach an audience. And again, I think the audiences were relatively unsophisticated. They weren't used to films and things of this sort. And not only did the Germans have this new technology where there wasn't a critical apparatus, they brought culture, the Nazis did, to the people in a way never seen before. Okay, this is an Australian example, but they would bring cinemas into the villages and towns to make sure that the people were exposed to Nazi propaganda, right? They'd come from Munich or Berlin or Frankfurt, and they'd go into the villages, and there were these plebiscitary spectacles like parades and such that would bring millions of people out, right? So the German people are being bombarded by new images and messages, and they're not prepared to deal with this. The Germans were very good, the Nazis were very good about a positive vision of what was happening in Germany, right? The people's car, the Volkswagen, never mind that only 1,500 were ever made and very, very few people got them. There was a sense that, these were the cars for the people. They're going to be on the Autobahn that's going to unify the nation. And all of this has been brought together under the term that's used by German cultural historians, the beautiful veneer of the Third Reich, right? This superficial, misleading sense that, there's progress and the economy is functioning and unemployment is down and what have you. And so this is the technology, it's really important to understand this. Because I have a thesis that I don't think the Nazis would have been as successful with indoctrination, with brainwashing the German people, if the German people had been more accustomed to culture and technology. It's a little bit like social media in 2016, where it was weaponized by Putin and Prigozhin and others and used to influence our election here. Now I think we're a little bit more savvy about social media, but it was weaponized in a very important way, and we weren't prepared to deal with that. So this is the nemesis. Now let's talk about the culture wars, section 2, right? The culture wars. Joseph Goebbels, Ministry of Culture, propaganda minister. And there was all of this Nazi art that Szyk was clearly aware of. It is of a realist variety, but of course it's sort of a strange, awkward, racialized art, right? There's always a kind of ideological message, and here it's about racial purity and the nuclear family, the strange nudes that are part of Nazi art. This is in the Bavarian State Painting Collections, the 4 elements, and you look at it and you say, something's strange here, but this was the Nazis' attempt to create a culture, right? A vision, a positive vision of what was happening in Germany. Of course, there's propaganda like this, the banner carrier. An American GI saw it in Albert Speer's office in 1945 and put his bayonet through Hitler's, the figure's cheek there. It's in the U.S. Army's art collection. But clearly it elicited a visceral response from the Army officer who stabbed the picture in this way. Of course, sculpture was probably the area where the Nazis were most accomplished. Goebbels and Hitler acknowledged that painting in Nazi Germany was kind of strange and underachieved in this way, but sculpture they were very happy with. But more generally, Szyk had to deal with a fascist aesthetic. This is who he was fighting against, right? And when you look at the gigantomania, the scale, the coordination, right? Leni Riefenstahl's work here, Triumph of the Will. When you can see the visceral power the Nazis were able to elicit in this way, the cathedral of lights that is there, right? They used the anti-aircraft lights to create this kind of church, this religious space at Nuremberg in this way. One of my arguments in my earlier book, Artists Under Hitler, was that many of the artists who worked in Nazi Germany were trained as modernists. They were trained in the modernist tradition, and this included Leni Riefenstahl, the maker of Triumph of the Will. And you can see the modernist elements that were part of the fascist aesthetic, right? The geometry, again, the size, the coordination of bodies. It's almost abstract at times, right? This is a still from Triumph of the Will. But this is powerful stuff, folks, right? And we have to recognize it. The camera angles and all the elements of the fascist aesthetic, this was the nemesis for Arthur Szyk. This is what he was having to fight, right? And not only the positive, if you will, scare quotes, but the negative, too. Remember, the Nazis attacked modern art, called it degenerate, and said that either if you made modern art, either you were a political subversive and you weren't making, a positive art, or you were physically inferior and you couldn't see colors and shapes as they really were. And of course, there's a whole elaborate anti-Semitism to the attack on modern art, and I won't go into that. But again, it was very high profile from 1937 onwards. The exhibition that attracted more people than ever before was the Degenerate Art Exhibition that went to 20 different cities in a 2-year period. And so, the Nazis were prosecuting a culture war. They were using posters, they were using symbols, sometimes strange symbols together, as we see a racism with anti-Semitism and mixing it with jazz. Or this one I've always found, Jews are either plutocrats with money or they're communists. However, you're both a plutocrat and a communist. But again, to think that there's all this visual culture out there. Sometimes it would be in forms of a World's Fair where the Nazi pavilion designed by Albert Speer, faced off with a Soviet pavilion. But again, just to appreciate his context, this is what he's doing, this is where he's fighting. The Nazis were good cultural warriors. They were effective, right? New media, unprecedented resources in this area. Joseph Goebbels was fiendishly intelligent, a PhD in literature. Some have called this the Nazi propaganda culture war, the war that Hitler won, right? And they were able to change the phrase used by David Schönbaum in a book that's 40 years old now, subjective social reality, what people thought, as different from objective social reality. When the war started, though, it made a Cold War into a hotter war, right? And of course, and we've heard about Szyk's personal elements in there. When Szyk came to America, he also had to deal with domestic authoritarianism or domestic fascism. I thought Philip Eliasov was really moving and strong last Thursday when he talked about the Lindbergh crowd and the silver shirts and the element in American culture that was sympathetic to the Nazis and to fascism too. So he has a lot to fight against in his culture wars, right? So how does he do it? What's his technique? And we've heard a lot about this, and I am, like my colleague, my partner, Wendy Lauer, I'm new to Szyk studies in here, but one thing I became aware of is that he navigates both what we call high culture, literate culture, if you will, and also popular culture. And the way he brings those together makes him particularly representative of this culture. So one of the scholars who I learned a great deal from is Peter Burke, a British scholar, and he wrote this extraordinary book on culture in early modern Europe, 1978. And Burke argued that there's two main cultural traditions in the early modern period. He calls it the Great Tradition, which is the tradition of high art, of literature, a written tradition, often in Latin and then in the vernacular, understanding art history and previous references, and that would be the Great Tradition. And of course, Szyk was part of that, right? And he was aware of the Holbeins. We heard yesterday about Dürer. I see Hieronymus Bosch in a lot of his work too. And so there's an erudition there with Szyk that's really important. Irv Unger said yesterday that Szyk had a big library, right? That's not surprising. And he's able to use all those symbols, all those references, all those allusions in there, right? I'm stealing a slide from Philip Eliasov the other day, and he talked about the precedent of the snake and Vermeer and that. And art historians can go to town with Szyk because he embraced the Great Tradition. Now, the little tradition, and I don't really like the phrase little tradition because it's a more popular tradition, that's popular culture, right? And today that would be everything from sports to music to what have you. At the time, it was things like the Palio, the great race in Siena. It would be carnival, the world turned upside down. It would be songs and gestures, and there's a whole popular culture. And so Peter Burke's argument, which applies to Szyk, I think, is that elites tended to be bicultural. They could operate in both the great tradition and the little tradition, and they knew how to do both. And I think that's what's part of the power of Arthur Szyk, right? That he does do both. I was so impressed again with Professor Eliasov last week when he talked about the importance of comic books in this period. And there were millions and millions of comic books that were being sold in the wartime, right? And so this is the little tradition, the popular culture that Szyk draws from, right? Of course, posters, and this was the great era of posters, and we had Bauhaus exiles who were coming, Herbert Bayer and others were making posters here. But this was, this was the golden era of posters. And so he picked up on that popular culture. And of course, he made his own. And we've seen this with his sense of humor. There's a line about gonorrhea, something in here too. But Szyk was making wartime posters, as we know. Magazines are part of that popular culture too, and this was a great era of magazines. And we heard about Saturday Evening Post with Norman Rockwell and Collier's and the healthy competition. But he tapped into this culture of journalism and periodicals. The playing cards, well, we learned today that they actually weren't produced, but he thought about them, and the Irv Unger has made them now. But again, that would be part of this tradition as well, right? Using popular culture in this way. So I just want to say that one of the reasons Szyk is so important is that he was omnivorous about culture, right? High, low, and he would take all these images and combine them in the most powerful ways. So I wanted to step to the final part of my talk, a little bit less, talk about this image here. Satan leads the ball. It is gone. It is missing. Do we not have it? It's Mr. Unger we have to thank for the one image that we do have. But I think it's really telling, and it shows his erudition, his ability to navigate high and low. And of course, we see some figures here that we can identify. The first over here is probably Hideki Tojo, who is the Japanese minister who, in a cabinet government, who took the lead, who was most high profile. And I'll say a few more words about the way he's portrayed in a moment. The second over here, going left to right, is General Ludendorff, Erich Ludendorff. He had been one of the two military dictators from 1916 to 1918, the last part of World War I, along with Hindenburg. But Ludendorff had gravitated to the far right and participated in the 1923 beer hall putsch, the Nazis' failed putsch. So he was part of that whole world, but more of a conservative German officer who had gone to the fascist, to the Nazi side. Ooh, let me go back. Then, of course, I think Arthur Szyk's favorite, Hermann Goering, and he relished in the corporeality of Hermann Goering, and I think he just had a great caricature. I don't think Szyk was as good with some of the other Nazi leaders. Himmler's don't always come off so well, but Goering is magnificent. And then on the end here, we see Marshal Pétain and Pierre Laval there, and all sorts of symbols with Laval having spats on it, and showing that he's an opportunist, right? He's holding a bag of gold there too, and Pétain with a Nazi armband. He's the leader of Vichy France and a collaborationist. And of course, Szyk was unsparing with the collaborationists. A few more before, and then I'll slowly finish up. We have Mussolini on the left. A sense of humor. He is missing his pants. The emperor has no clothes there. And of course, he has all these swastika insignia, as well as a Catholic cross, probably an indictment of the Catholic Church. The Lateran Accords and the Concordat and that too. But it's interesting how the collaborationists always are overdoing it with Nazi insignia, showing that they're trying to collaborate in there. The Goebbels figure here is very rich. He spent a lot of time on the Goebbels. He's massively armed with a dagger there and a huge pistol. He has a little jack-in-the-box thing with a Phrygian flap, the red cap from the French Revolution, the radical fringe there. But it's supposed to be something that's going to scare people. We see Hitler who's enveloped by he looks like a Bavarian. He's an industrialist. It says Schwerindustrie, a heavy industry in the front. Szyk was always aware of the economic basis, and there's a subtle academic analysis that's taking place here by all these symbols. But clearly, this is a suggestion that big business has embraced Hitler and he is the fact that Hitler is so small and industry so big is very suggestive in this way. So there are some figures who are a little bit ambiguous, and I'm not sure who they are, to tell you the truth. This may be Ribbentrop right there. It may just be a Nazi officer in a way. I believe this is Wilhelm Keitel behind Ludendorff. Keitel was head of the Joint Chief of Staff in Nazi Germany, right? So you get a sense he puts in, of course, skeletons and the suggestions of the death and the violence, right? So we see Pétain, Mussolini, Laval, Hitler, Goebbels. We've done the rest. So we have these other two figures at the front and the back, right? They're so interesting, right? So Satan here, right? And one of these beasts that goes back to the early modern period. Again, Hieronymus Bosch and others that are there. And you can see at the front the devil, the Satan, has the book of the Nibelungen Lied, right? And this may be a reference to Richard Wagner. Certainly the Brunhilde at the back is a reference to Wagner. And again, the culture wars that are being prosecuted here. Wagner with his anti-Semitism and the way he's moved Hitler and other Nazis. But also, I think more generally, he's trying to make fun of the Teutonic nonsense of the Nazis, right? All the myths, the Nibelungen and things of that sort there. But again, we see this strange beast with a dagger, and it doesn't conform to any animal that we know in this way. And then the only woman in the whole figure, Brunhilde at the back, right? And she has on her cloak, it's hard to see here, she has the words Juda Verrecke, death to the Jews. It's an old medieval phrase that the Nazis reappropriated there. And again, she's supposed to be this Wagnerian figure. So through a combination of, I think there's both the high and the low elements that come together in this magnificent picture, and I'm hoping that by drawing more attention to it, that at some point it will come to the surface and we will rediscover this painting. So thank you for your attention.